We're excited to announce the artist for the 2025-26 Gale Memorial Lecture Series Out of Bounds, Sheida Soleimani, tonight. And then the next one this semester will be Sherry Kreider, who will be joining us on November 5th, so please mark your calendars. And then in the spring, we will have Antonius Tanbui and Anthony Hudson. The Gale Memorial Lecture Series was established in memory of Dr. David Gale and his wife, Sylvia Gale, whose generosity made the series possible. This 2025-2026 Out of Bounds is sponsored by the Department of Art, the Women's Resource Center, the Tamarind Institute, the Feminist Research Institute, and both the foundations and photography areas. We are grateful for Arts Lab's partnership in giving us a place to host these lectures, and the Gale Memorial Lecture Series is always free and open to the public, except for when we reach capacity, which we have. Lastly, I want to thank the rest of the committee, Marcella Ernst, Welly Fletcher, and especially my advisor, Stephanie Woods, for all their support and guidance in organizing Sheida's visit. Sheida Soleimani received her MFA from Cranbrook in 2015 and has had a busy career of solo shows and group shows, including a current solo show at the International Photography Center in New York. Her works are in many collections, including the Guggenheim Museum, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, and the MIT List Visual Arts Center. Sheida is an associate professor of studio art at Brandeis University and the founder and executive director of Congress of the Birds. I came to know Sheida's work in early 2020 while working at Denny Gallery in New York. At that time, we began planning her first New York solo show at the gallery titled Hotbed. I was immediately intrigued by Sheida's need to make work that said something. It took a stance and often forced the viewer to educate themselves or re-educate themselves. I was then, and am still now, attracted to how visually dense her work is, pulling from many diverse parts of her life, such as her Iranian heritage, wildlife rehabilitation, and her queerness. Sheida's artwork cannot be separated from the fact that she is a wildlife rehabilitator and has an innate care for animals. We've been on calls in the past, especially while setting up her show, that she would stop all of a sudden and say, I gotta go, I gotta rescue a bird. Can I call you back? Or the both times I've had dinner with her in Providence have ended in bird rescues.
Forgot about that.
There are an extensive number of articles and interviews describing Sheida's work. She is the daughter of Iranian political refugees, a queer artist, an activist, and a federal wildlife rehabilitator. Today, we came to hear all that from her directly. Please welcome me in joining Sheida Soleimani.
Thank you.
You got it?
I think I'm good. What's up? How's it going, everyone? Thank you so much, Dylan, and to the Gale Memorial Lecture Series Committee for inviting me to be here. I'm so stoked to be here. This is my first time at UNM, even though my dad works here. My parents are in the back, which is kind of wild. I talk really fast. I'm really informal. I cuss a lot. I apologize for all of the above. If you have questions, literally just raise your hand and just ask me. I'm not into formalities. But I will start by saying that all of the things that Dylan said are true. I am indeed, the daughter of Iranian political refugees. I'm a federally licensed wildlife rehabilitator. And those things are really colliding in my work lately. I'm really interested in art that actually has to say something. I think being an artist is a political choice, especially in this climate. And I don't believe that art should just be beautiful or just be, a way of escape or a form of escape. I think it's the job of artists to challenge, what's happening in our world and to make comments on this time that we're living in. So I try to do just that. I don't always succeed, but I started this presentation with a piece that I made when I first got to grad school in 2013. So I started grad school, so a little over a decade ago. I just gotten out of, I took a year off after my undergrad, and I was at my BFA in Cincinnati, where I grew up. I grew up in like a pretty conservative suburb in Ohio, surrounded by cornfields and soy, and we were really one of the only families of color that were in the area. So post 9/11, that was a pretty wild time, and thinking a lot about this difference between like wanting to assimilate or being like accepted versus like these stories that I'm hearing coming from my parents and being like, wait, I'm not hearing all this shit on the news. Like, is this really real? Is this true? Is this happening? And so kind of thinking about those worlds colliding, when I was in my undergrad, I started making work about my own identity. And I think hopefully all of us have that kind of moment when we're like, hey, there's like a personal narrative or a story that I want to tell. And I remember that I was really discouraged in my undergrad. I had some white professors that were like, hey, this is really niche. Like, could you maybe think about making this work a little bit more global? How could you make these stories a little bit larger and a little bit more macro and a little less micro? And I was like, okay, well, I really want to make it in the art world. So how am I going to do that? And so I got to grad school and I started thinking about all the things that I care about. I care a lot about political climates. I care a lot about human rights issues, care a lot about environmental issues. And I was thinking about all of those things kind of colliding. And so I started thinking about GDPs, gross domestic product reports. If you're looking at Iran's GDP or output, over 80% of it is oil. But if you think about the things that happen because of oil, the corruption, oil as a lubricant, for cronyism and corruption, whether it be in the OPEC countries or OPEC being the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Iran is a part of one of those. And then thinking about the other industries in the country. About 10 to 15% of Iran's industry is agricultural. Pomegranates, pistachios, sometimes you'll see saffron. And I started thinking about what does a portrait of Iran look like in, its GDP. So this is the first piece I made in grad school. And I really was like excited. I was like, oh my God, it's so pretty. I can't believe I made this. And then I was like, wait, it's not enough. This is like way too fucking pretty and it means nothing. So then I wanted to keep going. So I started thinking about color as a political choice. In the 50s, the Soviets had this really incredible idea. If you assign color to a political party, you're more likely to get people interested in that political party, even if they don't know what that politic is or it stands for. Very similarly to like when we're voting in US elections. Maybe you live in a neighborhood that you think is relatively liberal. You like your neighbors on both sides of your house. Someone on your right side of your house has a sign that says, vote yes on issue 4. Someone on the left side has a sign that says, vote yes on issue 4. And then you get to the polls, and hopefully you're a relatively researched individual, but you forget to look up what the issues are. And you're like, okay, well, like, I like Joe that lives on my right side of my house and Sarah that lives over there. I think they're like on the right side of things. I'm gonna vote yes on issue 4 without even knowing what that issue is or stands for. Color revolution functions very similarly. By ascribing a color to a revolution, you're more likely to get people on board. You're kind of memifying it. And that's not a bad thing always, but it depends on how competent we are and how literate we are in understanding the issues of our time and how invested we are. So I started thinking about color as a political choice in my work. I was looking at like painting and I was studying with a bunch of like amazing colorists that were like, oh, you just have to look at the color wheel and, offset things. And I was like, I can't do that. That means nothing. Now I do actually look at color wheels, but we've come a long way. And I started thinking about ascribing political color and making political color choices in my work. So if you know anything about Iranian political history, which I don't imagine many people do, unfortunately, there was the Green Revolution that happened. It also happened at the same kind of time. This is the first time in my life, in 2008. I remember that I was seeing Iran on the news in a serious way for the first time in Ohio, in the suburbs of Ohio. I was like 17, 18, and I'm seeing, and I'm actually gonna give you a trigger warning now, I should have given you in the beginning. There is an image of a protest, of a protester, Neda Agha Sultan, who was murdered in the Green Revolution that is coming up. So, I'm for the first time seeing like Iran on the news, and there's all these like, it's kind of like trauma pornography, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe this is happening. Every time that there has been a revolution in Iran, it's brutally stamped out by the regime. And it was really crazy to like be privy to this, but not actually be able to, have inside knowledge. At the same time, Ahmadinejad, the president, also said that there are no gay people in Iran, which we all know isn't true. And so I was like really angry, really charged. And I was like 18, and I was like, I can't believe this is happening. Like, obviously my parents had seen it all before, and I was getting their commentary on it. And I started thinking about protest, political protest. What does that mean? What are, political parties? And thinking about, like, here you see the kind of streamers and the confetti, thinking about party supplies, hinting at the doctrines of political parties here. But just as quickly as it happened, and it continued to persist, it was shrouded very immediately in the news by the death of Michael Jackson, who I'm not saying is just not deserving of attention, but very different kind of way to shout out a revolution. So, we heard about it for about a week or two. We saw some really traumatic images online, and then all of a sudden, it was all about MJ's death. And I was like, wow, is that really crazy? This was really right as social media was also starting to become a form of protest. This was called oftentimes the Twitter revolution. And I was like, really just shocked that something like this could happen so quickly, be switched on or off, that our attentions could be, shifted. And so I made this piece, and I remember when I showed it in grad school for crit, I pinned it to the wall, and I threw a bunch of eggs at it because I thought that was really radical at the time. And we had a cold crit. And in a cold crit, if you've had one before, you don't talk for the first part of your critique. You let other people come and talk, and you listen, and then by the end of it, you're like, okay, what did I learn from what they're seeing? So people were watching, looking at this piece, and it really reinforced my kind of upset at people's illiteracy of political individuals in countries that are not in America. So the first person said, oh, I think that's her dad. I think this is a piece about daddy trauma. And I was like, what? And I just, you have to sit there quiet. And I was like, wow. And another person was like, no, that's Larry David. I think this is a party for Larry David. And I was shocked. The literacy or the illiteracy that we have for political individuals outside of our own country or countries that we are not attached to is really pretty upsetting. And so then I was like, okay, well, I guess I can't be using specific political figures in my work because people aren't going to understand it. And so that kind of took me, this was my first year at grad school, and that was like, oh, and here you might, there's always symbols in my work. So obviously, the sumac is a representation of the Persian New Year, Somar. It's one of the 7 things that you set at a table for the New Year. Anytime that there is, you probably also have heard the term Arab Spring, which was this kind of moment that the Green Revolution was lumped into. Obviously, we could talk about Arab Spring not really being a politically correct term either, but I was thinking a lot about this kind of spring and this moment of change being something that I'm talking about in this work. All right, so that didn't work. I was like, how do I find new strategies to make work that are, that we're thinking about transcending language or transcending boundaries? And I started thinking about protest. My father was and probably still is, maybe not in the same way, very active protester in Iran, and often would tell me stories about, going into protest and safety precautions against lacrimatory agents. Lacrimatory agents being things that cause tear gas. And in the same time, in Occupy Wall Street, images like this were being distributed. So defending against tear gas. If you mix water and Maalox or spray that in your eyes, you could protect yourself. My Baba would say that he would take Coca-Cola and put it on a towel or rub onions in your eyes before you go into protest to protect yourself. And so I started thinking about still life as a form of Dutch vanitas is kind of a jumping off point 17th century painting, and thinking about what a still life of protest looks like. So this is called lacrimatory agent. And then source imagery really comes in. So then I started thinking a lot about their stories, right? I didn't want to make work that was quote unquote personal, and so I wanted to make work that was about survivor testimony. In October 2014, 14 women, this is in Iran, had acid thrown into their faces for their hijabs not being worn correctly. They were not punished, and their survivor testimony became a form of telling stories for me, and I was actually in touch with quite a few of the people through human rights lawyers inside of Iran. And so creating source images, taking photographs of them, oftentimes with their consent, making these photographs that include the GDP, so rice, pomegranates, pistachios, kind of becoming this like backdrop for these people's faces that are glitched out, thinking about internet sourced images being blown up. Again, I'm showing you this work, but I would never make this work again. I think it's really important to talk about transformation as an artist. You know, like sometimes we make decisions and choices, and I was like trying to make ethical decisions and choices and working with these people. It was very much with consent, with conversation, but I'm still not interested in like the pornography of pain. And so that's something that I think a lot about when I look at this work that I made when I was 23. This is the image of Neda Agha Sultan, who was shot while she was marching with her professor and her father during the Green Revolution. She kind of became, you know, this is, if you don't know about Mahsa Zina Amini, who just got murdered during the Women Life Freedoms and Zindagi Azadi movement, Neda Agha Sultan was kind of this, like, I would say like another case that, you know, created a lot of alarm and a rallying cry for Iranians. And so I started thinking about, you know, this 1 minute and 52-second video that was put on YouTube. And on CNN, they were like, you know, the one quote unquote liberal station that we watched in the suburbs, you see this 1 minute and 52-second video, but you don't see anything because it's glitched out and pixelated. And in that video, you see her walking, you see her fall, and then you actually watch her bleed out and die. And it's all recorded. The same way that if we look at police body cam footage, it's, you know, we're reanimating the violence. If we can delete it and or, you know, rewind it and watch it over and over and over again, you can watch someone die over and over and over again. And what does that mean to be watching that moment? Is it ingrained in our minds? Are we, you know, so kind of just like numb to this form of trauma now that we're used to it? And so I took screen grabs of her face throughout that whole video when I was making this piece, and used those as the source images. Again, we have Sombol that's wilted. Sombol is another sign of the spring, the mortar of the country being oil. And then you see these sugar cubes. And my mama would always tell me this story about sacrificing lambs in Iran for ceremony or, you know, for holidays. And she would say that you would place a sugar cube in the lamb's mouth before you slit its throat as a form of making it happy before it died. And I think about that often as this form of pacifier, as this form of revolution in the country is becoming this pacifier, because every time a revolution happens, you know, there is this incredible force that's always stamped out. And so this has kind of become this recurring symbol in my work. Anyways, I made this work when I was 23. I started thinking about source images. I started thinking about layering. And here's another one. I'm going to try to go a little faster because there's a lot to talk about. This is Rehana Jabari, who was executed on October 24th, 2014 for attacking her rapist. So under Sharia law, women are not allowed to defend themselves. The evidence was that the male had claw marks on his genitalia. And she was executed as a cause. So this is another kind of image about her. People oftentimes ask how my images are made. They're really shitty. They're constantly falling apart. They're taped onto walls. Everything I own is probably covered in stains from tar. There's spray paint everywhere, often in my hair. Anyways, I'm really interested in like the idea of being a photographer as being a magician. There is also this idea of photography that I think is very, you know, I mean, it's a genre that's been dominated by straight white dudes forever, basically. And what does it mean to document something? For a really long time, I wanted to be a photojournalist. I remember I was looking at like Sebastião Salgado photographs and being like, oh my God, these are so amazing. Like, photojournalism can change the world. And I remember on a trip in Puerto Rico with my parents, I lifted my camera to take a photo of someone that was in a situation that was not as fortunate as mine, and I felt really gross about it. And I was like, why is this that we have to document the other in this way? So I think photojournalism oftentimes is a male-dominated form. The lens is a dick that penetrates the world non-consensually, is how I say it. And so how can we make photography a more consensual practice? How can we create or build worlds? And that's what I try to do. I try to build stages that I photograph. And so I try to photograph, I mean, they're really shitty, but they're like lit with really nice lights to try to like offset how awful they are. So these are like, you know, this was at grad school, so there were really nice lights in grad school because I didn't have to buy them. I'm thinking a lot about product photography, you know, thinking about how we buy things, how we buy ideas, how we buy politics. And can I use that type of advertising language to make my work really hot? Can you take something really, really traumatic and make it really hot as a form to trick people? I'm really interested in Trojan horses because oftentimes people are unwilling to engage with trauma if it's too traumatic to look at, right? And like, why should we be looking at traumatic images? Why should we be looking at images like Napalm Girl? You know, like that was a turning point for Vietnam. And like, while that is an extremely important image, I think the way that we've taken images has really changed. And so can we take difficult ideas and transform them in a way that tricks people into paying attention? Because I do think in this like visual and cultural economy, that's what we have to do. It's unfortunate, but it's true. All right, so that got me out of grad school. I graduated. I was like, what the fuck do I do? The art world is really daunting. I remember when I told my parents I wanted to be an artist, they were like really supportive of me, except my mom was like, you're gonna work in a coffee shop forever. And I thought I was gonna work in a coffee shop forever. So, and I did for a while, and that was fine. But yeah, there's this like overwhelming panic of like, do you make art that appeals to the art world, and what does the commercial art world want? And I tried doing that once and it felt really gross. So I was like, you know, I'm just not gonna be in the art world. All right, one sec. Okay. So I graduated from grad school. I was working on all of that work in this series called National Anthem. I was thinking about survivor testimony. I was thinking about queer individuals inside of Iran who are, you know, marginalized individuals who are, you know, being harmed for their sexuality, for their political beliefs, all of the above. And I was like, okay, you know, something that I really missed here was like my mom. I grew up with my parents telling me stories about what their lives were like, and my mother was in solitary confinement. And I oftentimes think about how many of the women that were also in solitary confinement with her did not live. And so what does it mean to have your identity erased? I started thinking about the women who are consigned to oblivion. Every year in Iran, hundreds, if not thousands of women are killed and erased under the dictatorial regime. And so I started thinking about uncovering some of their stories. I mean, Amnesty International covers like maybe 5 to 10 a year, but there's a lot more than 5 to 10. So this has started to oblivion. So I don't know if any of you guys are in psych classes or, you know, Albert Banderas, the wire monkey experiment is kind of his most famous one, but he's really interested in observational psychology. The Bobo doll experiment is one of his most famous experiments. And before the Bobo doll experiment kind of had like its final iteration, he was doing these kind of iterations of how children absorb what they see around them, which like obviously we know they do. But there's 2 test groups of kids, 20 in one group, 20 in another. Group 1 gets to go into a room and it's filled with toys that were, you know, current in that time in the 70s, building blocks, like crayons, you know, I don't know, whatever kids play with. I didn't really have proper toys, so I don't know. And then the second group of kids, and then they had this thing, I don't know if you guys know what Bobo dolls are, but they're like kind of those like really creepy clown-shaped punching bags that are like weighted at the bottom, and you push them and they come back up at you. And so the first group of kids went into that room and they all played with like whatever, but most of them ignored the Bobo doll. The second group of 20 kids, before they went into this room, they watched this video, and that's what this top dark kind of image is. It's of an adult model, a woman, so kind of like a mother figure, ignoring all of the other toys in the room except for the Bobo doll. She punches it. She holds up a toy gun. She drags it on the ground. And it's not rocket science. Kids are sponges. So every single one of those 20 kids, when they went into the room, actually ignored all of the other toys. They only played with the Bobo doll, and they only behaved aggressively towards it. I mean, look at this like unhinged little girl holding a hammer. Like, it's really wild. It looks like it's just like horror movie material. And so I was really fascinated by like this kind of observational psychology and how this is embedded into society. In Iranian society, aggression on women is endorsed. It is something that is normalized. And that's what I really wanted to start talking about into oblivion. So I started making photographs. Instead of using source images printed on paper, I started printing them on fabric. And I started kind of taking these figures of individuals that did not get fair trials under Iranian law, and turning them into these Bobo dolls. Not that they're meant to be punched or dragged, but they already have been. They've already been beat up by the society. So this is Sakine Mohammadi Ashtiani, who was convicted of murdering her husband, which she did not do. And so placing them into these photographs, these are images of her on her trial when she's getting convicted. And then again, you kind of see, and I was working with some human rights lawyers inside of the country who were sending me some images. You might notice that they're pixelated. Obviously, they're low-res images that are sent to me. And so what happens when you blow up a low-res image, it gets pixelated. So I'm like really trying to hint at these web-based origins here. Again, you can see that they're really shitty. This is before I had like a nicer camera too. This is like in the garage that I had. Like, you know, when you get out of school, you just do whatever the fuck you can to make work. If you want to make work. And if you want to keep making work, you'll make it happen. So I was teaching my day as a diversity fellow at RISD, which was the worst job I ever had in my life. If you get asked to do a diversity fellowship, I'm really sorry. Usually you probably should unfortunately do it because jobs are hard to come by. But it was pretty soul-sucking. And so then I would get home because I was told that I had to work constantly. And fortunately for me, my father's immigrant motto is comfort equals death. So I think the death drive is really real, and I just worked nonstop. And so I would get home from soul-sucking work, and I would make really tragic work. So this is Rehana Jabari's mother taking flowers to her daughter's unmarked grave. And then she sent a photo of herself on her last phone call with her daughter before her daughter was executed. And this is an image of her daughter in her trial as she's getting convicted of, you know, needing to be executed for defending herself. And so I really started thinking about, and then here I am, I had my first show like in London with a gallery. I had my first ever interview with like a magazine, and I was so excited that someone was like paying attention to this work, because I was like, okay, like someone can learn about what I'm doing and what's happening in Iran, and like maybe I'm gonna make a change or create a statement. And I remember after divulging all of this stuff to this journalist, she wrote this article that came out in London, and it said, does anyone want an image of an executed woman hanging on their wall? And that was her clickbait article. And it was actually a complimentary article. It was like nice, and it talked about the history. But with a title like that, I found that journalists aren't responsible. Oftentimes I've spoken to journalists, they get facts completely wrong. They oftentimes make things up. They fabricate things. I've had my parents call me and be like, Sheida, did you say that? And I'm like, no, the journalist completely fabricated that, because journalism also isn't a responsible medium. And so this really kind of irked me. You know, like we're supposed to be, as an activist, you're trying to like spread awareness about something in the art world. You want to share something with a sliver of society that might not be, you know, embedded in this culture. And I was becoming very quickly disillusioned. And this was when I was 26, 27. It's a little young to become disillusioned, but I'm a cynical bitch. So, you know, what can I say? So, you know, I was making this work, and I started thinking like, okay, well, I don't know if I'm ready to tell these stories yet, or how do I tell these stories? And I started thinking about, I don't want these images to be sold. You know, after that article came out, I think I wanted these images to be open source. I think something else that, so I was asked by the New Museum and Rhizome to create this project called The Download. And The Download is a folder that anyone can go onto the website and download, and it unpacks and unfolds however you want it to. There's images, there's people that have done it in varying ways. When I did it, I did a nesting set of folders that are all folder titles that are named with sentences from Rehana's letters and her last message before her execution. So as you open the folders, you're kind of going down this rabbit hole. But when you get to the last few folders, you know, you could kind of choose your own journey. But unfortunately, no matter how you end, it always ends the same way. She dies on October 24th. But I, you know, also wanted to embed not like, I want you to like learn all of this stuff with these execution records, with where they were executed, with these letters translated, you know, with these audio messages, with like a computer AI voice reading the English translation. But they also end with 2 high-res photographs. Not that anyone should care about art in this case, but they're open source and anyone can download them and print them how they want. And I think that's really important for me. I think also it's really important to think about like, who gets to actually like see art, right? Like, especially in our current climate, like, people that get to engage with art are really fucking privileged. People that get to go to school for art are really privileged. And so what does it mean when we're sitting around in our like colleges and universities and throwing around these like ideas that, you know, are like, oh my God, this matters, right? And then they go into these museums that, you know, are funded by blood money and funded by Israeli arms manufacturers. And who is it reaching? And I think something that's really something important to think about if you are making work. Like, yeah, maybe we're reaching some people in the art world, but I think by making work that's open source, by zines, by distribution, by posters, maybe there are other ways of getting outside of this kind of glass ceiling that we're all unfortunately stuck in. Okay, so I'm fast forwarding through a lot of work that I made. I made this like really heavy work to oblivion. It was really depressing. I was literally like, you know, sewing these forms of like lifeless women. I was reanimating them. I started teaching at 25 as this diversity fellow, and like I was only like a few years older than my students, but they were all talking about this self-care thing. And that felt really wild to me. I was like, what's self-care? Like, you want me to like go get a facial? Like, you want me to like get my nails done? Like, I'm not that kind of guy. And they were like, no, Sheida, like you do really like intense work. Like, what makes you happy? And I started being like, you know, it's a good question. Like, I thought like being successful would make me happy, but again, that's like some ingrained immigrant mentality that you're like, oh, success is happiness, right? It's not. It can be if you like your job, which fortunately I do. And so I started thinking about animal rehabilitation. I grew up with a mother that would bring all sorts of animals into our house that were harmed or maimed, and, you know, would talk to me about caring for them, and I, by proxy, learned how to care for them. And I remember I started therapy for the first time in my life, kind of late, at 26, and I went to therapy because I was so traumatized by academia. And my therapist in like the first week was like, so like, why don't you try something that makes you happy? And she asked me what made me happy, and I said, I think wildlife rehabilitation makes me happy. And she said, okay, my homework assignment to you is to like find a place to like volunteer or do that. So the next week I came back and I'd already started volunteering. And again, it's interesting. You'd think that people that care about animals or do this type of work would be like nice people. A lot of them are like crazy right-wingers. You would not believe the amount of like hunters that do wildlife rehab. It's a really weird nexus. But I was like, okay, I want to do it, but I want to do it on my own. So I got certified and I started working with these animals, seeing, obviously, and we'll get into that later, animals that are harmed by human infrastructure. Around the same time, fast forward, I made a bunch of work in the series called Medium of Exchange. I was queering politicians. I'm thinking about oil as a lubricant for corruption. It was really like funny work, like super cynical. It was like, you know, these kind of like BDSM like situations between politicians. And it was really nice and fun and light to make after making work about like executed, tortured people. But again, it was the same problem of showing faces of politicians. No one had the literacy to understand who I was depicting. You know, Ban Ki-moon was only the head of the UN for a few years, and then when he's not the head of the UN anymore, how are we gonna remember him? So fast forward to 2020, before the pandemic, January 3rd, sitting at a bar in Texas, and I see my last name flash across a screen at the bar. And I was like, oh, that's not good, you know? Again, because Americans don't have literacy, and my last name is flashing across the screen, I was like, fuck, like, this isn't great. You know, Qasem Soleimani had been assassinated by Trump, or by, you know, America. And very quickly, I started getting texts rolling in from people being like, oh my God, Sheida, we're so sorry for your family. And I thought they meant that they were sorry for my family because I was gonna deal with a lot of shit from people that didn't have literacy. But it turns out they didn't, because they thought we were related. And I started thinking about how my father has always used humor as a form of deflection. And as a form of like, I don't know, kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes, like going to a restaurant in Ohio and someone being like, oh, your accent, where is it from? And he'd say, from here. And they'd be like, no, before that. It's from Indiana. No, before that. Oh, it's from Connecticut. And so there's always this kind of like trying to figure out where someone's really from. And in the same way, I started responding to people and saying in this kind of humorous way, thank you so much. I really am mourning my uncle right now. my uncle Qasem Soleimani, and people would believe it. And so I started really thinking about, and they'd be like, we're so sorry, Trump is so awful for what he did. People didn't know who Qasem Soleimani was. He was an awful man. And so what does it mean when we're blame shifting? Who is good, who is bad? Who are these fingers that are pointing at one another? Well, one of them is Donald Trump's and one of them is Hassan Rouhani's. But you're not gonna know which is which, because there's this interesting kind of part of blame shifting here. Who is bad, who is good? You might see like, oh, someone's hand is a little bit more orange and stubby. Like you're maybe looking for markers, but they're both just disembodied politicians' hands. I also think a lot about like political gestures, like body language coaching and training is like astrology for politicians. And so this kind of like gesture of like pointing and like masculinity, you have the war hawk and the peace dove. Obviously, I'm really not interested in ascribing identity to sentient beings that, like can't take on that identity themselves. Doves are not really that peaceful. They're really rapey, honestly, just so you know. And hogs are just really dumb. I don't find them warlike at all. And so thinking about these kind of associations, in the background you have source images of PS-752, which was a Ukrainian jet that was shot down by Iranian missiles. The black flag, the white flag. And so all of these, like, you look at this image and you're like, oh, this guy must be good, right? And this guy must be bad, but who's who? This is what kind of initiated my show Hotbed, which is when I first met Dylan. This is when COVID happened. The health minister of Iran came on TV, sweating profusely, wiping his brow and saying, we have no COVID in this country at all. At the same time, satellite images are showing mass graves that are being filled with lime powder because there's so many bodies that are like literally, like you see these satellite images, this is all lime powder in Behesht Zahra, which is like a really big cemetery in Tehran. And so I was really starting to think about these like disembodied gestures, the truthfulness of politicians. We're always looking for like, oh, if someone's hands are behind their back, it actually is exposing their chest, so it means that they're comfortable, but also are their hands hiding something? Obama did this thing where he spoke like this with his hands kind of open and his fingers pointed because that was a trusting gesture for individuals, but you never ever speak like this unless you're Trump or a dictator. And so I started thinking, this is my series, Lovers of Power. I was looking at events that were happening between Iran and America and some of the like Swana region as well. This is Ruhollah Zam, who was this man that led this news channel called Ahmad News. He was lured back into the country, caught, executed, but first charged with this corruption on earth. Which is a charge under Sharia law. And one of the examples were that he was teaching people how to make Molotov cocktails on his news channel. And so I'm thinking about kind of like the hands of the supreme leader and the hands of Ruhollah Zam, kind of like entangled by this Molotov cocktail. Hopefully, obviously we know one of them died, unfortunately. And then looking at, images in the New York Post of, is Qasem Soleimani really dead? Like these kind of sensational images that I find like really fascinating. They're like, the hand that was found amputated has a different ring than a hand that he's wearing in a picture. And so kind of thinking about this reflection of his hand in life and this reflection of his hand in death. All right, and then one of the last images, obviously, if you don't know, Mahsa Zina Amini was murdered by the Islamic regime for not wearing her hijab correctly. This was, a few years ago now, September of 2022. Is that right? Moan? Yeah. So, here we're looking at an image of her in life. These images leaked out of a hospital where she was being treated. I'm not a doctor, but that doesn't look normal. Blunt force trauma to her head, and so her brain was bleeding. And so thinking about these images of those brain scans kind of becoming the backdrops to these images, or to these photos, her hand in life, holding this white hijab for White Wednesday as a representation of when women were going and burning their hijabs in city centers. Okay, so there's a bunch of other work that was made in between about reparations packages. How am I on time? Am I good? 7 minutes. All right, let's go through this real fast. New things, thoughts, work. I started thinking a lot about if I had the responsibility or the language to talk about the personal shit that I never actually got to talk about. My parents will very readily tell you that I'm kind of like a disaster thinker. And so when COVID happened, I was convinced that they were gonna die because my dad's an essential worker. And I was like, fuck, like I'm never gonna tell their stories. They're gonna be dead before I can do anything. And I remember in the early 2000s, there was this kind of moment where like survivor testimony of like immigrants was being ghostwritten, and there were all these ghostwritten books, and my baba would say, one day I'm gonna have someone ghostwrite one of our books. And then the pandemic happened, and I was like, he's gonna die, and he's never gonna have had anyone to ghostwrite his book. So I have to do it, obviously, and I can't write, so I'm gonna ghostwrite the only way that I know how. And that was through photography. And so I called him at the end of 2021, and I called my mom, and I asked if I can ghostwrite their stories and if I could photograph them. And they said yes, under a few conditions: that the work is collaborative, that I'm not making like unilateral decisions or displaying things that they're not comfortable with. I said, okay. And my father has this kind of tendency to like really be like, okay, Sheida, like what is this about? Like tell me everything that this means, and if this isn't accurate, then you shouldn't include this. And I've always brainstormed with them about my work. And then my mom will be like, why don't you add this here? Or like, why don't you add like a skull to symbolize death? And I'm like, okay, well, let's like rework that a little. And so this kind of became this back and forth practice. In 2013, when I was in college, in undergrad, she did this drawing for me because I was trying to go to Iran before I started making like political work. And it's a drawing of the house that she grew up in which she tells me many stories about. And it's kind of like the center, the nexus. It's where, you know, my father hid under bags of rice in a rice cellar when they came to arrest him the first time, and they didn't find him. It's where she grew up. It's where her father planted these, you know, trees that she then buried dead babies under, which is a whole other story that I don't have time to get into. But this map has been something that I've kept since I was 23. And I started thinking about, and this is a photo of the naranj that is one of the trees, and she said that the babies were buried under this tree. Also, she was a nurse, so to help contextualize the dead babies. I also started thinking about documents of certification, especially now. What are the documents that mean that we are legible or illegible inside of this country? The stamp on their, you know, passports, admitted as a refugee. What does that mean? I also just saw that there's an application now to seek asylum in Iran that's a fee of $100, not in Iran, but here in America. It's $100 now if you want to apply for political asylum. And it's renewable. If you don't get it within a year, you have to keep paying $100 until maybe it goes through. And so I started thinking about this kind of house, these documents. These are the first photos that I made of them, and I remember thinking about a lot of different things. My mom's drawings as a way for her to tell me stories, to process these narratives. The picture of the house that she grew up in, this is a photo of its ruins. It was made out of mud bricks. The drawing that you see is of a snake with a piece of bread and salt. So old wives' tale, nuno namak. You ward off snakes by giving them bread and salt. Obviously, that's not true. But I started thinking about also games. I started thinking about snakes and ladders. It's a game of luck and chance, right? You climb the ladder, you succeed, but then you get bitten by the snake and you fall down. And that's very much the story of being an immigrant or a refugee or someone trying to escape a totalitarian regime. You know, my father was really lucky to have smugglers. Not everyone that makes that journey has that ability or has that network or is able to do that. And so it really is this game of luck and chance. So you see these kind of like motifs of checkerboard themes that are fractured. You're thinking about game theory. Obviously, this is like a fake Persian carpet, so I'm thinking about Edward Said's Orientalism here. All of these things are like layered and packed in. And then the birds come in, which I can get into because I have a lot more to go through. I remember as a kid, the fancy restaurant that we would go to is Olive Garden, and they would bring crayons for me as a kid because I would draw, obviously, but then my mom would draw, and she would make all these crazy drawings. But one that she did repeatedly, this is a newer version of one of her drawings, but I remember she would make oftentimes drawings of her solitary confinement cell. And she would talk oftentimes about this window and where the light would come through. And that is something that's always stayed with me. And so in this work, Panjere, which means window, I blew up her drawing and placed her back into that cell. And what does that mean? You know, the ladder's this kind of hope, you know, symbol of luck and chance. And then you have a crow, which is a bird that was in my clinic, Congress of the Bird. So I rehabilitate upwards of 2,000 birds every year. I run a wildlife clinic hospital, not hospital technically, it's a clinic, and sanctuary. And so a lot of these birds that started appearing in my work are patients. In this image, she was kept in Hoi. So this is an image of that prison, her hands kind of emerging from the paper bars, holding an eastern bluebird that I rehabilitated that we then released together after this photo was made. And she told me something that I didn't know at the time, that she's only written one poem in her life, and it was a poem that she wrote when she was in solitary. And it's this poem about being a bird that's trapped, that everyone has forgotten about, and how we need to wake up and pay attention. And so that is hand screen printed on this photograph. I also think about like frames as the vessels that carry bodies through the world, right? And these bodies are photographs. And so these frames are stamped with replicas of stamps from their passports. So they get to travel throughout the world on their own. In the gallery, I started thinking about inverting space and time. I'm really interested in magical realism. Obviously, an obvious text to read is Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. But if you think about 100 Years of Solitude, this thing in magical realism that I find really fascinating is that time is not linear, and that's a political choice. You don't know where past or present or future is, right? And you're scrambling it, and you can't recognize what's happening. And I think about these stories in the same way, because I wasn't there. I'm only privy to these stories because of what they've told me. And so past, present, and future is very much scrambled. And I'm interested in building these worlds. All right, the suitcase that my father escaped the country with. I'm gonna try to wrap up really quickly. The suitcase that my mother escaped the country with. Homages to them as freedom fighters and political workers. There's so many stories I could get into, so I'm gonna flip through these really quickly. A story that my father would always tell me about, this revolution song that I learned, which was like the first thing I ever sang in show and tell in Ohio, which didn't really go over very well. But it's called Oftad Karana Jangal, which basically is like this whole song about every year the tulips in the mountain. You know, tulips every year, they die after they bloom, but then the bulbs replicate and they come back, and there's more of them every year. And so it's the song of kind of resistance. The red tulip was a symbol of the left, was then co-opted by the right, but now the left is trying to reclaim this as a symbol. Safekeeping, I'm thinking about the lineage of pastoral care. My mother is a wildlife rehabilitator. Her greatest joy in life was being a nurse. And when she was unable to work as a nurse, when she came to the States, she started working with animals, and that's how I got into this work. And it's really like one of the only things that I feel like, I'm too cynical of a bitch to like think that anything makes a difference, but I feel like it's one of the only worthwhile, meaningful things that I do. Mythology is really important. She always talk about this fruit called a batabi. I've never seen one before. She's never seen one. This is a drawing of one. The closest thing that there might be close to a batabi is a pomelo. So I kind of made these like amalgamations of like random citruses to try to recreate this fruit that she made a drawing of. And so the drawings that she makes are like a huge, like majorly important thing for me, right? Because how am I supposed to like understand? I'm just getting like oral histories, and I'm getting these drawings, and they become a huge part of this work and this collaboration. And my dad did a drawing too. This is him and the border crossing the mountains, which actually became the backdrop for one of the parts of the exhibition. He also talked about being in a safe house in the mountains and playing chess. And you see kind of the road with the smugglers. And this is kind of what I'm kind of having this like crisis moment, because I feel like I made my like magnum opus and I could never make artwork ever again. But I made this piece. My father would talk a lot about the story of him escaping over the mountains. And like everyone has this like uphill both ways story that their like grandfather or dad or like whatever old timer told them. And it was like, it was so hard, like working, and I worked so hard and 58 hours in a day, and there is only 24 hours in a day, but I was working more than that. And I was like, I remember like hearing all these like Ohio kid stories, and I was like, well, my dad escaped over the mountains on a horse and he almost got frostbite. And they were like, no, that didn't happen. And I was like, yeah, it did. And it's like all of these kind of like mythologies that are actually real. He doesn't remember the name of his horse, which I find tragic. I mean, like, I would hope to remember the name of this creature that carried me to safety, but I think there were more pressing things. So, you know, I've always wanted to recreate this horse, and I finally did. And he decided that he would be willing to ride this horse that I made for this photo. And it's probably my favorite image I've ever made. I made it last year. And then images of the snake kind of being this, you know, is it good? Is it bad? My mother really loves the rattlesnake that lives in the arroyo behind her house. And then this kind of like takes me to like my current like work that I'm like, I think it's just really important like as an artist to not be like, oh my God, I know what I'm doing, because I don't. And I'm trying to make this like, I'm still working on Ghostwriter. It's really important to me. It's gonna keep transforming, but it's like, you know, really crazy to not pay attention to this other aspect of my world in which I care for creatures that are maimed by human infrastructure all the time. My phone number is public. I get text messages, sometimes up to 50 a day. If you hang out with me like Dylan has, you might come on a bird rescue willingly or unwillingly. And you might end up holding something in the backseat of my car. And it's pretty devastating work because you see things that are so maimed that you have to sometimes euthanize them. Out of the 2,000 patients that I get per year, I would say at least 70% of them I have to euthanize. And so what does it mean to hold a dying body? What does it mean to make the decision to terminate something's life? Especially as something that can't communicate with you if they're ready to go or not ready to go. But the gift of death when something is in a lot of pain is a gift, I think. These are some of my patients / children. This is a fishing hook inside of a great blue heron's leg. It had osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection. It was not healable, and so that was a euthanasia. Owls oftentimes get hit by cars. This is a cormorant that had a lesion in its mouth from a fishing hook. This is a hawk that had bowfly larva in its ears. It's called fly strike. I do some pretty gross work. And so I started thinking about like this kind of obsession that the world has with animal-human collaboration and this idea of like pressing like this collaboration onto a sentient being that can't consent. And so I started thinking about, I mean, like, is it ethical, is it not? So I started making work with the birds. I'm just going to scroll through it really fast. Window strikes are the #1 cause of wild bird deaths, and right now we're in the middle of a migration. I just checked 22 million birds flew over New Mexico last night. Put decals on your windows and turn your lights off at night. Patients that die in my hands, I started documenting them through shooting film, which is so wildly different than my work, right? Like this is like, I'm like, how the fuck did I make this? This looks minimal, it's film, it's close up, it's sentimental. I'm not sentimental, I'm actually really sentimental. This is a bird that hit a window so hard that its feathers were deposited on the glass. It has neurological trauma. This is a bird with pesticide damage, congenital defects from pesticides that I had to euthanize, same thing here. Testing for deep pain responses when something's paralyzed. This is a small wood thrush, an owl covered in oil. And this is how I kind of like negotiated them in the ICP. I'm gonna flip through these really quick. They're photographs that are mounted on screen prints from a roll of film that my mother shot when she was in Iran before the revolution. They're images of the sky. So I wanna place these birds back where they belong in the sky, but obviously I can't. Parts of her drawing, so the pancere, the window from her cell. Windows strike birds. Here's my dad's drawing on the wall that's holding his image. I know I'm out of time, so these are my exhibition images. And this is my exhibition that's up at ICP right now that closes in, I think, what day is it today? It closes in 4 days. And sorry to go over time. Thank you so much, Dylan. Thank you, everyone, for having me. Thanks. I don't believe in raising hands, so you could just yell at me.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I got to see this before hearing that you were coming here.
Oh.
And it was so beautiful. I took like, I think like probably 20 images of the exhibition, and I was so struck by the use of your mom's and your dad's illustrations in the installation of the images. And so hearing you talk about the frames as bodies for those stories, I'm curious how that, like how you would articulate then the walls of the gallery becoming like another body to hold those bodies?
Absolutely. I'm interested in screenplays. I'm interested in theater. I'm interested in building worlds, right? And so the photograph is its own world. But like when you walk into a space, like what is that space that's holding that work? And so I think about the gallery as like who's entering stage right, who's entering stage left. I don't know if you can tell in the documentation images, but everything's kind of spotlit like they're a character in a play. And so I think about the drawings becoming the backdrop and the basis of these stories, because I would know nothing of these stories if it wasn't for their drawings that came with them from my mom's side, or the stories that came over dinner time with both of them, or on the long drives that my dad would take me on when I was a kid. Yeah, the walls kind of become another vessel.
Yeah.
Thanks. Glad you got to see it.
Yeah, me too.
It still feels like I'm kind of in the like, oh my God, I can't believe that's it. Like I did it. Like, I don't know. I think the come down after a big show is kind of tragic. Don't recommend. Anyone else?
If you could say anything to like an undergraduate art student or a graduate art student, like just getting started with their stuff, and they're like, what would you say to them? What's the one thing that you would?
Oh God. Oh. Okay, well I won't tell you what I grew up on, which is comfort equals death. You should do self-care. I think it's very important. I think be overeager. I think people have this tendency. I remember when I was an undergrad, the first week of school, I had some like shitty fucking dude professor be like, there's 100 people sitting in this room, and like only 5 of you are gonna go to grad school for art, and if you're lucky, 1 of you will make it in the art world. And I remember being like, I wanna be the one that makes it, please let me make it. And like, that's not like, we don't wanna have that kind of attitude, right? It's about like, do what you love, and if you care about it, continue doing it. If you really want to be an artist, then like go the fuck out of your way to take down the name of every visiting artist that comes and get their email addresses and be overeager and send them your work. Like talk to them. I remember the first studio visit I had with a woman of color when I was an undergrad. I started sending her burned CD-ROMs of my photos to New York City. And then like when I would go to New York, I'd call her and be like, will you please meet with me for coffee? And she would, because she was like, I can't believe like this person's so overeager. Like make your own world, find your own community. Also art world and art school like are really wildly competitive, but it's really good to find your people because they'll be there for you forever. You know, like all of my friends from grad school, actually I hated most of my cohort in grad school, but I have one best friend, and that one best friend of mine, Troy Hoffman, will always be there for me. And now he's an executive like director at Hauser and Wirth, which is like crazy. I mean, it's too crazy, but like we help each other out. And so like pick your family, pick your community, be humble, don't have an ego, but be confident in yourself, and be there for people, but be overeager. Just be really wildly fucking overeager.
Don't blame me if I take your advice after this.
Please do. No, I'm serious. Like the amount of studio visits I have where I'm like, okay, I'd love to see your work develop, and then no one asks me for my like email address. I'm like, all right, that's on you.
Got one more question.
Okay, is your bird place, the Congress of the Birds, is that inspired by the Conference of the Birds?
It is.
And if so, then what bird would you be?
I would be Tritura pelagica, a chimney swift. They are my favorite birds, and I don't pick favorites lightly, but they are the bird that I specialize in. They're an aerial insectivore. They migrate every year from Peru all the way up the Atlantic flyway to the East Coast. They're podiform, so they're called footless ones. And I have a photo of my dad holding some, but It's not in this presentation. But what I like about the Conference of the Birds is that all the birds come together to find a leader. And they decide that they lead together, not that one is really more important than the other. And I happen to live on Congress Ave, and so Congress of the Birds is the name of the nonprofit. But yeah, I didn't really talk more about the rehabilitation work, but if you're interested, you could check us out on IG. It's Congress of the Birds. You'll find it. It's a lot of people, like lots of videos of like me wearing masks feeding birds. It's really like one of the truest joys of my life. So like I will also say as a piece of advice, find a fucking hobby that isn't art. Because it will make you like have a healthy relationship to the work that you do. And find a hobby outside of academia if you decide to go into it too. Like learn how to play the piano or the guitar, or like take lessons or like garden or do something else. Be like a triple, kind of like jobbed person. I mean, it's like really wildly destabilizing, but like it's really nice. But yeah, I would be a chimney swift.
Thank you so much, Sheida.
Thank you guys.